Good evening. Last week I spoke about Mark Twain, and I told you that together with Henry James, these two were the greatest American authors of the end of the 19th century. So today we are speaking about Henry James, and you will see how Twain and James actually differ, but in one respect they are very similar. Namely, they are both frontiersmen, which means that they wrote about the frontier. The only difference is that Mark Twain wrote about the palpable frontier, whereas Henry James wrote about the spiritual frontier between America and Europe. So another great difference between Mark Twain and Henry James is that Twain set his stories in America, whereas today we remember Henry James as an American author who lived mostly in Europe, and his novels are mainly set there, although they explore American issues, as you will see. So um, I will read James's view on this. He says, Europe must educate America, which was gross, vulgar, materialistic, and uncultivated, and America would gladly accept this submissive role. Whereas for Twain, the opposite was true. America should educate Europe. But the two were very influential. For example, they both focused on the same topics in two of their early works. One was Twain's Innocents Abroad, which was his most famous travel account, and the other was Henry James's Daisy Miller, because both of these describe Americans in Europe, and Henry James will return to this topic over and over again, especially in his late novels. Let me first tell you something about Henry James and his life. He was born in America, of course. He was born in New York, where he lived until he was 12, and then his family was rich, so they took James to Europe, and he was educated in various places, which are also mentioned in Daisy Miller, such as Geneva and Paris and London, where he would eventually live by the end of his life. Uh, this experience of being tutored in Europe at an early age affected James and his choice of topics, which was to show the differences between the old world, which was Europe, and the new world, which was America. He did go back briefly to America to study for a year or so, but he never finished his studies, although when he was much older, he did receive an honorary degree by Harvard University. James started publishing his shorter pieces to a magazine called The Atlantic Monthly, and then he decided to try and just write a novel. So his first novel was very unsuccessful. It's called Watch and Word. Na srpskom je to bilo nešto kao Štićenik i štićenica. Tema ovog romana je zaista melodramatična i onako je, rekla bih, tacky. So this is why Henry James didn't want to admit that this was his novel at all. So he would claim that his second novel, Roderick Hudson, was actually his first novel. So Watch and Word is a melodramatic novel which features a wealthy, older gentleman who, in a way, adopts a 12-year-old girl, and eventually he wants to marry that girl. So you can see that the topic is quite controversial, and it's probably why it did not succeed. The next novel is called Roderick Hudson, in which you have a talented sculptor who is an American, and he goes to Rome. He's literally taken under the wing by this wealthy man in Rome, and in Rome he becomes older age, but we are shown some self-destruction on the part of his fame, and this novel was extremely popular. There is one character in the novel called Christina Light, with whom Henry James was so fascinated that he decided to make her appear again in another novel of his, which is called The Princess Casamassima, and Christina Light is the character with whom Roderick Hudson falls in love eventually. In 1876, Henry James lived in Paris, and this year is important because then he met many famous characters in Paris, such as Flaubert, for example, Émile Zola, Turgenev, and so on. So, around this time, the end of the 19th century, Paris was the place for artists, not only writers, but also sculptors, painters, and so on. And this will continue way into the 20th century. His third novel was written there. It was called The American, and it features a successful American businessman who goes to Europe. So you will see that the main topic of Henry James's works reiterates over and over again because they feature Americans who spent time in Europe or who settle in Europe and now they have to adjust to the way of life in the old world. And you know probably already that Daisy Miller is about that as well. Now, this novel, The American, was later made into a play because Henry James had some playwriting inclinations, although he was not such a successful playwright. Namely, when he produced his second play called Guy Dumbbell, he went on the stage after the performance and he was booed at, he was laughed at, so he had to abandon the stage pretty embarrassed. Also interesting, an interesting fact is that Daisy Miller, the novel or novella, it was also made into a play, but it was never performed, and the play and the novel differ significantly in terms of the plot. So that was a brief digression. So, speaking about Daisy Miller was Henry James's first actually successful novel that made him popular both in Europe and America. Now, Daisy Miller is the first of many American young naive, let's say, girls who appear in his novels. You will see similar heroines in The Portrait of a Lady, Isabel Archer, then Millie in The Wings of the Dove, and you have Maggie in The Golden Bowl, for example. Henry James was a very prolific writer. So I will speak about Daisy Miller at the end of this lecture. Let me first tell you something about The Portrait of a Lady, because this novel belongs to his, let's say, first serious phase in novel writing. He wrote 4 novels then in his first phase, but The Portrait of a Lady was the most popular and the most successful. This novel, I remember that the students were obliged to read this novel by James as part of the course called The American Novel of the 19th and the 20th Century. We don't have this course anymore, but it was an excellent course, and I was a teaching assistant back then. And I remember that it was such a torture to read The Portrait of a Lady. And this is why I decided for this particular course to read Daisy Miller instead, because it's much more appropriate and easier to read. I had to choose a novel which features a young American girl who spends her time in Europe. If I wasn't obliged to do so, then I would probably choose The Turn of the Screw, which I consider his best story. But back to The Portrait of a Lady, the main heroine is called Isabel Archer, and she, surprisingly, of course not, is a young American naive woman, but she's very strong willed and she's very ambitious. She wants to be accepted in European society. And in Europe, she meets 2 American fellows who are actually swindlers. One is a female character, Madame Merle, and the other is a male Machiavellian hero called Gilbert Osmond. There is a very successful and I think interesting movie made based on the novel, in which Isabel is played by Nicole Kidman and Gilbert Osmond is played by John Malkovich. So I would recommend the movie rather than the book in this case, which is again very surprising for me. So that was the portrait of a lady, just briefly mentioned. Then there was another phase, great phase of prolific novels such as The Bostonians, the already mentioned Princess Casamassima, The Reverberator, in which he satirically comments on the power of media back then, which is actually quite relevant for us today, and The Tragic Muse. That all comes from this second period and from his period of playwriting. But I will move on. I'll just fast forward a bit in time because I'm not going to dwell on every detail since James had such a rich life. And mention the story, The Turn of the Screw. This story was published in the collection of stories called The Two Magics. And it is a Gothic story, very popular. Even today, it has been made into numerous TV shows, movies, you name it. I know of one particularly good version, which was done by the BBC, and I will link that movie for you later. I've recently heard that there is a new version of The Turn of the Screw on Netflix, I think. And I also recently saw a TV show called The Haunting of Hill House, and I think that that story is heavily based on James's The Turn of the Screw. In this Gothic ghost story, there is a governess who comes to take care of two children, and children are very, very scary. Whenever they appear in a horror movie, you know it's going to be scary. So these children are quite unusual. A brother and sister, Miles and Flora, and the governess starts seeing ghosts around the house, and she thinks that these ghosts want to steal the children's souls. So something like that. But of course, there are many twists and turns of the screw, and I think it's a very, very nice Gothic story if you're into horror. The next and final phase that I'm going to mention is considered James's best. It features the following novels. The first two were not that successful: The Awkward Age and The Sacred Fount. But the three that I'm mentioning now were his best, according to the critic's opinion: The Wings of the Dove, The Ambassadors, and The Golden Bowl. So the first one was published in 1902, The Wings of the Dove, The Ambassadors in 1903, and The Golden Bowl in 1904. So we are already stepping into the 20th century, but Henry James was a typical, I think, American Victorian writer if we regard the themes that he dealt with. So, The Wings of the Dove, I mentioned it already. It features another very rich American heiress. Her name is Millie, and she gets very ill over the course of the plot, and she has two suitors and many, well, let's say, false friends. So, as she is getting worse and worse, we are exposed to the world of deceit and everybody just wanting to get her money and not actually her love. So this will be The Wings of the Dove. If I remember correctly, what's the name of the wife of Tim Burton, who plays Rose always with Johnny Depp? Never mind that actress. She played Millie in the movie version of The Wings of the Dove. The next one is The Ambassadors. Henry James claimed that this was the best of his works, and in this novel, The Ambassadors, you have an American who goes to Europe to fetch a son of his fiancée and bring him back to America. Now, that son is living in Paris, and Paris at the time was also considered a place of debauchery and immorality. But of course, once he reaches Paris, he discovers that his own views on life will be changed. This novel is especially important because it influenced another quite fascinating novel written in 1955 by Patricia Hicksmith, and the novel is called The Talented Mr. Ripley. I am absolutely sure that you have heard of the famous movie that was made in 1999. If you haven't seen The Talented Mr. Ripley, please do. This is a movie that I've seen numerous times, and anytime this movie would come up on TV, I would sit down and watch it, although I know what's going to happen, but it's so interesting. It features Matt Damon, Gwyneth Paltrow, and Jude Law, who is so handsome in this movie, trust me. And the final novel that I'm going to mention before Daisy Miller is The Golden Bowl, in which you also have an American heiress called Maggie. In the movie, she's played by Uma Thurman, and her father, who is also a very rich art collector. And of course, it's also similar. There are many swindlers in their world, and there is a complicated love triangle, if I remember correctly, in this novel and movie, which is also quite good. So as you could see, Henry James's novels and the plots were so interesting to the public that even today they are relevant and they have been made into successful movies that are dearly watched even today. And one of those that was also made into a movie is Daisy Miller, which is our focus of all these works that I mentioned. Before I go to Daisy Miller, just let me tell you that by the end of his life, Henry James became an English British, let's say, subject. He received honorary degrees from Harvard and Oxford, and he also got the Order of Merit for his efforts during the First World War. He died in 1960. So, Daisy Miller. This is now very strange. There is a movie based on Daisy Miller. It was directed by Peter Bogdanovich, and this is strange because the movie follows the text of the novella so closely that there is no difference whether you read the novel or watch the movie. So here, in this particular case, I would also recommend watching the movie because you will not lose any text and you will get to see how this director envisioned what James wanted to say, and some of his solutions are hilarious. Trust me, there are some scenes that are very unexpected and that do not feature in the novel. For example, the posh members of society drinking their 5 o'clock tea in the swimming pool with their full clothes on. So this was, I think, very strange to see. The eponymous heroine is played by the beautiful Sybil Shepherd, and I think the movie is greatly done. So, what is this story about? Let me just remind you that Daisy Miller is his early novel. It was published in 1879. So Daisy Miller is the first of all these numerous heroines, American heiresses that appeared in his subsequent novels. The story begins in Switzerland, not in America. So we are in Europe, in Switzerland. There is this grand hotel where we meet Daisy Miller, who is an American girl from New York, Schenectady, and we meet Winterbourne, who is one of the main characters. Here, Winterbourne, of course, is a symbolic name because he's somewhat frigid, let's say, stiff, like frozen. Daisy is very unlike European girls. So she's an American girl, and her way of behaving shocks all the members of European society, and even Winterbourne is, well, let's say, confused and puzzled by her freedom to act and to speak. When they meet again in Rome, because the story changes settings several times, they meet again in Rome, and Daisy Miller is in the company of another important character called Giovanelli. He is a fortune hunter, and he is described as, this is a quote, a gentleman with a good deal of manner and a wonderful moustache. So Giovanelli, of course, wants to get close to Daisy Miller because of her fortune, and she doesn't care. Um, Everybody criticizes Daisy, and despite these criticisms, she, let's say, deliberately exaggerates the way she behaves, and she doesn't care. That is her protest against the views and the manners of the old world. In a scene near the end of the novel, Winterbourne encounters Daisy and Giovanelli alone at night at the Colosseum. You all know the story about the Colosseum because it was an arena in which um, people fought with animals. And the Colosseum was also known as a breeding place for malaria, or as they call it, the Roman fever. So, this is where Daisy Miller catches the disease and eventually she dies. Now, the ending is very unexpected. So, you do not expect Daisy to die because the novella has a somewhat humorous tone, but she does. So this is what makes it a tragedy, and this is what Henry James actually wanted. He promised to make a tragedy in this early novel. So Daisy's death, which happened because she visited the Colosseum, can be seen also symbolically, since the lions and the wild beasts of the Colosseum are actually the posh members of the high society in Europe, and also all the American expatriates that Daisy meets in Rome and in Switzerland. Henry James himself was and is remembered today as the most famous American socialite. He was a bachelor, and he was an expatriate all his life because he moved permanently to London at the end. So I hope you will see some of these movies that I mentioned because it's Christmas time, it's holidays, so you have enough time to see them. They're all romantic and easy to follow and easy to watch. They do remind me somewhat of the movies based on Jane Austen's novels. So it's that kind of a vibe. So with Henry James, we finish the crux of our course, and there is only one author left to speak about, and that is Ambrose Bierce, who was the master of horror, and we will read his story together, The Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, whereas with Atza, you will read another story called The Damned Thing. So see you next time. Bye.